wind in the Arizona territory did not merely blow, it scoured. It was a physical weight, a living thing that picked up the red grit of the desert floor and drove it into the pores of skin and the grain of wood, until everything, living or dead, wore the same dusty coat. It was 1878, and the land was parched, the sky a relentless, pale blue lid clamped tight over a frying pan. Here, distance was not measured in miles, but in water. Between the scattered ranches and the huddled, fearful towns, there stretched vast, silent plains of creosote bush and mesquite, broken only by the jagged, purple teeth of distant mountain ranges. Silas Vance wiped the sweat from his eyes with a forearm that was brown as cured leather. He stood knee-deep in the irrigation ditch he had been fighting to clear for 3 days. The mud was heavy, sucking at his boots, threatening to dry into concrete before he could shovel it out to the bank. His corn, stunted and yellowing, rustled dryly in the hot breeze behind him. It was a poor crop on a poor patch of land, 40 acres of hardpan that no one else had wanted, situated too close to the hills and too far from the safety of the settlement. Silas was 34 years old, though the lines around his eyes and the gray streaking his dark beard made him look 10 years older. He straightened his back, feeling the familiar pop of vertebrae, and looked toward the horizon. There was nothing out there but heat shimmer and the wheeling shape of a turkey vulture. He lived alone. The silence of the homestead was absolute. It was a silence he had courted, a silence he had built like a fortress, inside the small cabin of rough-hewn logs. There was a bed he slept in alone and a table set for one. There was a time, 4 years ago, when a woman named Clara had filled the space with the scent of lavender water and rising dough. But the frontier fever had taken her in 3 days, burning her up while Silas held her hand and watched the light fade from her eyes. After the funeral, after the neighbors had stopped coming by with covered dishes and pitying looks, Silas had locked a part of himself away in the pine box with her. He told himself he stayed for the land, but that was a lie. The land was cruel. He stayed because he deserved the hardship. He stayed because when the wind howled at night, it sounded like the screaming he remembered from the Tonto Basin, years before he met Clara. He had been a scout then, riding with a cavalry unit out of Fort Verde. He had been young, angry at the world, and convinced that he was bringing civilization to a savage land. He remembered the smell of black powder and burning thatch. He remembered the way the village had looked in the morning light, the bodies of women and children scattered like broken dolls among the wickiups. He had not fired the shots that killed them, but he had led the soldiers there. He had found the trail. The blood was on his hands just as surely as if he had held the saber. Now, he drank cheap whiskey at night to dull the edge of that memory. He sat on his porch, staring at the empty dark, waiting for a judgment that never seemed to come. Only silence and the coyotes yipping in the canyons. It was a Tuesday when he hitched the mule to the wagon for his trip to town. The supplies were running low, and he needed nails and flour. The ride to Dry Creek took 4 hours under the punishing sun. The town was a collection of false-fronted buildings clinging to the edge of a dried-up wash, looking as temporary and fragile as a playing card house. Silas tied the mule at the rail outside the general store and beat the dust from his hat against his leg. The air smelled of horse manure and sawdust. Inside the mercantile, it was dim and cooler, the shelves stocked with tins of peaches, bolts of calico, and boxes of ammunition. He moved quietly, gathering what he needed. He was a man who took up little space and made less noise. But as he carried his sack of flour to the counter, the bell above the door jangled, and 3 men walked in. The air in the room shifted, thickening with tension. At the front was Jebediah Holt, a rancher who owned 3,000 acres of prime grazing land closer to the river. Holt was a big man, his belly straining against a linen shirt, his face flushed with heat and righteousness. "I tell you, it is not over," Holt was saying, his voice booming off the tin ceiling. "I lost 2 calves last week. Clean cuts. That was no mountain lion. That was 2-legged predators." The shopkeeper, a timid man with spectacles, nodded nervously. "It has been a quiet summer. Mr. Holt, maybe they have moved south." Holt slammed a fist onto the counter, making a jar of peppermint sticks rattle. They do not move south. They circle back. They are like wolves. You think they are gone, but they are just watching from the ridgeline, waiting for you to turn your back. Silas placed his flower on the counter, keeping his eyes down. He wanted no part of this. He knew the hate that burned in men like Holt. Holt had lost a brother in '69, and that grief had calcified into a hard, blind rage that saw every Apache face as the face of a murderer. Holt turned, noticing Silas for the first time. His eyes narrowed. "Vance, you live out there on the edge. You seen anything?" Silas felt the weight of the room settle on him. He kept his voice flat. "I have seen nothing but jackrabbits." Holt stepped closer, smelling of tobacco and stale sweat. "You are too close to the hills. Vance, if they come down, they will cross your land first. You ought to keep your eyes open. Instead of burying your head in the dirt, I mind my own business," Silas said, counting out coins onto the wood. "That is the problem," Holt spat. "A man minds his own business until he wakes up with his throat cut. We are getting a posse together next week, going to sweep the foothills, flush out any stragglers. You should ride with us. You used to be a scout, didn't you? You know how to track them." The memory of the burning village flared in Silas's mind. The smoke, the screaming. He pushed the coins across the counter. "My tracking days are done," Holt sneered, looking around at the other men for validation. "Look at that, a man who won't defend his own neighbors. Maybe you like them out there. Vance, maybe you prefer their company to ours." Silas picked up his flour sack. He did not look at Holt. He did not look at the shopkeeper. He walked out into the blinding glare of the street, his heart hammering a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He hated the town. He hated the fear that hung over it like a foul miasma. But mostly, he hated that he understood Holt's anger, because he knew what the war had been. It was a cycle of blood that never ended. The ride back to the homestead was long. The sun dipped low, painting the desert in bruised shades of purple and orange. By the time Silas unhitched the mule, the first stars were piercing the twilight. He sensed the change in the atmosphere before he saw it. A homesteader developed a sixth sense for his own territory. He knew every stone, every fence post, every shadow. Something was wrong. It was small things at first. The next morning, he went to the coop to gather eggs and found the nests empty. A coyote, he thought, but the wire mesh was intact. 2 days later, he noticed that the wood pile had shifted. 3 logs were missing. He had not burned them. Then came the footprint. He found it near the creek that trickled through the back of his property, the lifeline that kept his corn from turning to dust. It was in the mud near the reeds. It was not a boot print. It was a moccasin print, small and light, barely an indentation in the earth. The toe turned inward slightly. Silas stood over the print for a long time, his hand resting on the grip of the Colt Navy revolver at his hip. The wind whistled through the cottonwoods, sounding like a warning. Holt was right. They were watching. He spent the next 2 nights sitting on his porch with a Winchester rifle across his lap, fighting the urge to sleep. He watched the shadows lengthen and twist. He heard the snap of twigs, but he saw nothing. The ghost remained a ghost. On the 4th day, the heat broke records. The air was so hot it felt solid, difficult to inhale. Silas was working near the barn, repairing a harness. When he felt the thirst hit him, he walked toward the creek, wiping grime from his neck. He came through the brush silently. It was an old habit, the scout's tread, rolling the foot from outside to in, breaking no sticks. She was there. She was on her knees at the water's edge, bent low, drinking with a desperate, animal intensity. She cupped the water to her mouth with dirty hands, splashing it over her face, her neck. Silas froze. His hand went to his gun, instinct taking over. She must have heard the slide of leather or the intake of his breath. She spun around, crouching low, water dripping from her chin. In her right hand, a rusted knife appeared from nowhere, held with a trembling but practiced grip. Silas stopped. He looked at her. She was small, painfully thin. Her cheekbones were sharp ridges under skin that was darkened by sun and ingrained dirt. She wore a dress that might have once been calico, now faded to a gray rag, patched with deerskin and rough twine. Her hair was chopped short, uneven, matted with dust, but it was her eyes that held him. They were wide, black, and terrified. They were the eyes of a creature that had been hunted for miles, across deserts and mountains, until there was nowhere left to run. She looked at the gun on his hip, then back at his face. She did not speak. She braced herself, the knife point wavering slightly. She looked ready to die, but she looked like she would make him kill her first. Silas looked at the knife. It was a pitiful thing, barely more than a shard of metal wrapped in leather. He looked at her ribs, visible through the torn fabric of her dress. He remembered Holt's voice. Finish the job. He remembered the burning wiki-ups. Silas slowly moved his hand away from his hip. He held his palms out, open and empty. I am not going to hurt you, he said. His voice was rusty from disuse, cracking in the dry air. She did not move. Her eyes darted to the rifle leaning against the cottonwood tree 10 yards away, then back to him. She made a guttural sound in her throat, a warning. Silas took a half-step back. You are thirsty, he said. Drink. He gestured to the water. She did not look at the water. She watched his hands. She was trembling, a fine vibration running through her entire frame. It was not just fear, it was exhaustion. She was starving. Silas moved very slowly. He reached into his pocket. She flinched, the knife slashing the air. But he only pulled out a strip of dried beef jerky he kept for his midday meal. He held it out. Food, he said. She stared at the meat. Her throat worked. The hunger was a physical force, pulling her forward, warring with the terror that held her back. Take it, Silas said softly. He tossed the meat gently. It landed on the grass between them. She looked at it. Then she looked at him with a fierce, calculating intelligence. She snatched the meat up with her free hand, never taking her eyes off him, and backed away toward the dense brush on the other side of the creek. She moved like a shadow, silent and fluid. Wait, Silas said. She paused, half hidden by the tamarisk. He pointed to the sky. The sun was a white blaze. Too hot, he said. You will die out there. She did not answer. She vanished into the brush. Silas stood by the creek for a long time, listening to the water bubble over the stones. He felt a strange hollowness in his chest. He should ride to town. He should tell the sheriff. He should find Holt. That was the law. That was what a white man did in the territory in 1878. But he didn't. He walked back to the cabin, his boots heavy on the earth. That evening, he left a plate of beans and cornbread on the porch rail. He went inside and bolted the door. But he did not sleep. He sat in his chair, listening. An hour after dark, he heard the faint scrape of the plate. The next day, she was still there. He caught glimpses of her, a shadow in the barn loft, a movement in the cornfield. She was watching him, assessing him. The heat did not break. By noon, the world was bleaching out. Silas worked on the fence line, driving posts with a sledgehammer, the rhythm punishing. When he stopped to drink from his canteen, he saw her sitting in the shade of the barn, watching him. She was no longer hiding. Not fully. She was too weak to hide. He walked over to her. She tensed, but she did not run. She was sitting on a pile of old hay, her legs drawn up. Come inside, he said. She looked at him, uncomprehending. He pointed to the barn door. Shade, water. She hesitated, then slowly stood. She followed him into the dim, stifling heat of the barn. It was cooler than the outside, smelling of dry straw and mule leather. He pointed to a stall he didn't use, where he had piled fresh hay. Sleep, he said. He brought her a bucket of water from the well, cool and sweet. She drank it until he thought she would burst. Then she curled up on the hay, the knife still clutched in her hand, and closed her eyes. Silas went back to his cabin. He stood in the center of the room, looking at the empty walls. What are you doing, Vance? He asked himself aloud. He knew the answer. He was courting disaster. If Holt found out, if the town found out, they would hang him. They would burn his place to the ground. She was the enemy. She was the terror that kept mothers awake at night. But when he looked at her, he didn't see a renegade. He saw a human being who had been ground down to bone and gristle by the same unforgiving world that was grinding him. He waited until nightfall. The desert cooled rapidly, the temperature plummeting as the sun vanished. The wind picked up, whistling through the chinks in the logs. He took a heavy wool blanket from his chest. It was a good blanket, one Clara had woven. He walked out to the barn. It was pitch black inside. "Are you there?" he asked into the darkness. There was a rustle in the hay. "I brought this," he said. "Cold tonight." He draped the blanket over the stall door. He heard her movement, the soft scuffling of straw. A hand reached out, dark against the pale wood, and pulled the blanket down. "Thank you," a voice said. It was the first time she had spoken. Her voice was low, raspy, the English heavily accented, the words shaped with difficulty. Silas felt a jolt go through him. It was just 2 words, but they bridged the gap between man and animal, between hunter and prey. He stood there for a moment longer. He wanted to say something else. He wanted to ask her name. He wanted to ask where her people were, but the silence felt fragile, and he was afraid to break it. He turned and walked back to the cabin. That night, he lay in his bed, staring up at the roof beams. The wind rattled the window pane. Usually, the sound made him feel isolated, the last man on the edge of the world. But tonight, the silence felt different. He was aware of the barn standing 50 yards away in the dark. He was aware of the small, breathing presence inside it. He felt a tightening in his chest that he hadn't felt in years. It was a mixture of fear and something else, a heavy, aching sense of responsibility. He had told himself it was just for one night. He would give her food, let her rest, and in the morning, she would be gone. She had to be gone. But as he closed his eyes, Silas Vance knew he was lying to himself. He knew that by opening his door, even just a crack, he had let something in that he would not be able to easily push out. He felt the weight of his past, the soldiers, the raids, the dead women, and for the first time in a long time, the scale tipped, just slightly, away from shame and toward something that felt dangerous, reckless, and terrifyingly like redemption. He rolled over, pulling his own quilt tighter against the chill, and listened to the wind, wondering if she was warm enough. The justification for her presence began as a negotiation with the elements. One night turned into 2 because the wind rose up, a howling devil that threw sand against the cabin walls with the force of buckshot. 2 nights turned into 3 because the wolves came down from the high country, their mournful, hungry cries circling the homestead like a tightening noose. And 3 nights stretched into a week because the heat settled over the valley with a weight that felt personal, a crushing anvil of white sun that made travel a death sentence for anyone without a horse and a full canteen. Silas Vance told himself he was merely being practical. A dead woman on his property line would bring the sheriff and questions he did not want to answer. But as he watched the sun bleach the color out of the sky day after day, he knew the truth was simpler and more dangerous. He was letting her stay because the silence of the cabin had become unbearable, and the sound of another living, breathing creature nearby was a narcotic he could not bring himself to quit. She did not stay idle. The Apache woman, he did not know her name yet, had a capacity for work that matched his own. She saw what needed doing and she did it, moving with a silent efficiency that unnerved him. When he went to feed the chickens in the gray light of dawn, he found the corn already scattered and the eggs gathered in a basket by the door. When he went to chop wood, he found kindling already stacked, the pieces broken to the perfect length. They worked the land together, separated by 10 feet of polite, wary distance, bound by the common enemy of the desert. The landscape was a hard master. The wind was relentless, grinding the red dust into the creases of their necks and the beds of their fingernails. Their lips cracked and bled. The skin on their hands blistered and turned to callus. One afternoon, a dust storm rolled in from the south, a towering wall of brown that swallowed the mountains and then the sun. They were out by the irrigation ditch, fighting to shore up the banks before the wind tore them down. "Inside!" Silas shouted over the roar of the gale. She did not argue. They ran for the barn, the sand stinging their faces like needles. They tumbled through the heavy doors and Silas slammed the bar down, plunging them into a gloom lit only by the shafts of dusty light cutting through the cracks in the wood. The roof rattled violently, the shingles groaning under the assault. They sat on opposite sides of the threshing floor, catching their breath. The air in the barn was thick and hot, smelling of old hay and the ozone scent of the storm. Silas took a drink from his canteen and offered it to her. She took it, her fingers careful not to touch his. "Water is low," Silas said, his voice loud in the enclosed space. "The well has dropped another foot." She nodded, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand. "The rain does not come." "No," Silas said. "It does not." They sat in silence for a long time, listening to the wind trying to tear the world apart outside. It was in these moments, trapped by the weather, that the language between them began to take shape. It was a cobbled-together thing, a bridge built of broken stones. She pointed to the mule in the stall. "Daju." Silas frowned. "Daju?" She shook her head, a ghost of a smile touching her mouth. "No, Daju." He tried again, twisting his tongue around the guttural sound. She corrected him, her voice soft but firm, repeating the word until he got the cadence right. When he finally managed it, she looked down, hiding a shy, reluctant amusement that softened the harsh angles of her face. In return, he gave her English words: bucket, rope, cloud. She learned quickly, her eyes watching his mouth shape the sounds, her mind absorbing them with the same intensity she used to watch the horizon. "My name," she said suddenly, later that week. It was evening, the purple light softening the brutal edges of the land. They were by the well, measuring the depth with a weighted string. Silas looked up. "What is it?" "Ilke," she said. "Ilke," he repeated. She nodded. "It means dawn, morning." Silas looked at her. She was standing in the fading light, her patched dress hanging off her thin frame, her face marked by hardship, but her eyes were clear. "My name is Silas," he said. "Silas." She tested the word. "It is a hard sound, like stone." He gave a dry chuckle. "I suppose it is." The sharing of names seemed to unlock something. The next day, as they worked to replace a rotted post in the corral fence, she spoke of her people. She did not look at him when she talked. She focused on the wire she was twisting, her hands strong and scarred. She told him of a camp high in the Dragoon Mountains, hidden in a canyon where the sun only reached for a few hours a day. She spoke of sickness that had swept through the lodges the winter before, a coughing sickness that took the old and the very young. She spoke of the hunger that drove them lower, into the path of the ranchers. "There are not many left," she said, her voice flattening out, becoming a recitation of facts rather than a story. "Many dead. The blue coats, the soldiers. They came 3 winters ago. They burned the winter stores. They took the horses. They took people." Silas froze. He was holding the hammer, ready to drive a staple into the wood. The term blue coats hung in the air between them, sharp as barbed wire. He watched her hands. They had tightened on the fence post, the knuckles white. She was not looking at him. She was looking at a memory, and her eyes were dark with a hatred she was too tired to shout. Silas lowered the hammer. The shame that he carried around like a stone in his gut suddenly felt heavy enough to crush him. He could have stayed silent. He could have let her believe he was just a farmer, a man who had always turned the earth and nothing else. But looking at her, seeing the dignity in her posture despite the rags she wore, he could not lie. "Not about this. I was one of them," he said. The words were quiet, clipped. She stopped twisting the wire. She did not turn her head, but her entire body went rigid, like a deer catching a scent on the wind. "I rode with the cavalry," Silas said, forcing the words out. 5 years ago, before I came here, I was a scout." He stared at the wood grain of the post, unable to meet her gaze. "I thought I was keeping the territory safe," he said. "I told myself that. But then I saw I saw what happened after the fighting stopped. I saw the women, the children. His voice trailed off. He remembered the smoke. He always remembered the smoke. I left, he said. I put down the uniform, but that does not wash it off. The silence that followed was louder than the wind. He waited for her to run. He waited for the knife to appear. He waited for her to spit on him and leave him to his rotting fence and his empty life. Finally, she turned. Her face was unreadable, a mask of copper and shadow. She looked at his hands, then at his face. She searched him for a long time, looking for the soldier he had been. "You are here now," she said simply. She turned back to the fence and picked up the wire cutters. The subject was closed, but the air between them had shifted. The tension was still there, but it was no longer the tension of strangers. It was the tension of two people standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down at the same abyss. The outside world, however, refused to stay at bay. 2 days later, the threat that hung over the valley materialized in a cloud of dust on the road. Silas saw them coming from a mile away. 3 riders, moving fast. He was chopping wood, and Ilkay was in the garden, weeding the rows of struggling beans. "Get in the barn," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Hide in the loft. Do not make a sound." She did not hesitate. She dropped her hoe and vanished into the darkness of the barn. Silas wiped his sweaty palms on his trousers and waited. The riders slowed as they approached the gate. It was not Holt this time, but 3 of his hands, hard men with dusty coats and rifles in scabbards. The leader was a man named Rourke, who had a face like a dried apple and eyes that missed nothing. "Morning." "Vance," Rourke called out, leaning on his saddle horn. Silas walked to the gate, keeping his hands visible. "Rourke, what brings you out this far? Looking for strays?" Rourke said, his eyes scanning the yard. "And looking for vermin?" "Holt says there is sign of Apache moving through the wash to the east." Silas kept his face impassive. "I haven't been to the East Wash." Rourke nudged his horse closer. The animal snorted, smelling the water in the trough. "We found a camp about 10 miles back. Cold ashes. Tracks heading this way." "You sure you haven't seen anything? No shadows moving where they shouldn't?" Silas felt his heart hammering against his ribs. A frantic bird trapped in a cage. He knew Rourke was looking at the garden, at the 2 hoes lying in the dirt. He was looking at the fresh laundry hanging on the line. Was there anything there that looked too small? Too feminine? "I told Holt in town," Silas said, his voice steady. "I see jackrabbits. I see coyotes. I mind my own business." Rourke spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust near Silas's boot. "It is a dangerous time to be minding your own business. Vance, if you are hiding anything, or if you are too soft to do what needs doing, the town won't look kindly on it." "I am hiding nothing." Silas lied. The words tasted like ash, but he said them firmly. Rourke stared at him for a long moment, the suspicion plain in his eyes. Then he pulled his horse's head around. "Keep your eyes peeled. Vance, we'll be back this way in a few days." Silas watched them ride off, waiting until they were nothing but specks in the shimmering heat before he let his breath out. His knees felt weak. He had lied to his own kind to protect her. He had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. He walked to the barn. "Come out," he said. "They are gone." Ilkay climbed down from the loft. She looked at him, her eyes wide. She had heard him lie. "Why?" she asked. Silas shook his head. "I don't know, but he did know. He just didn't know how to say it." That night, the atmosphere in the cabin was different. The barrier of caution had eroded, replaced by a raw, vibrating awareness. They sat at the small table, eating a stew made from the last of the salted pork and the beans she had saved from the garden. The lantern cast a warm, yellow light over the rough wood. Silas reached for the pitcher of water at the same moment she did. Their hands brushed. The contact was electric. His skin against hers, rough against rough, warm against warm. Silas pulled his hand back as if he had been burned, and she jerked hers away, clutching it to her chest. They looked at each other, then quickly looked away. But the air in the room had changed. It was charged, heavy with things unsaid. Silas could hear her breathing, a soft, rhythmic sound that seemed to fill the corners of the room. He could smell the scent of her, dust, sage, and something uniquely hers, like rain on dry earth. They finished the meal in silence, but it was not the empty silence of before. It was a silence that waited. She was the one who broke it. She pushed her plate away and looked at the lantern flame. I have a story," she said quietly. Silas looked at her. "Tell me." She took a deep breath, her fingers tracing the grain of the wood table. "Years ago," she said, her English halting but determined, "before the soldiers came to my village, I was near the mission. The place where the men in black robes live. I was hiding, watching." She looked up at him, her dark eyes searching his face. "I saw a man and a woman, white people. They were standing by a wagon. The man, he did not grab her. He did not pull her. He put his hands on her face. Like this." She raised her own hands, cupping the air. "Gentle," she said, "soft." And the woman. She did not pull away. She leaned into him. She closed her eyes. It was not taking, it was giving. Silas watched her, mesmerized by the intensity in her voice. She paused, looking down at her hands again. I saw warmth in his eyes. Not hunger, not anger, just warmth. She looked at Silas then, and the naked longing in her expression hit him like a physical blow. "I saw it once," she whispered, "and now I want that." Silas felt a lump form in his throat. He looked at this woman who had seen her world burn, who had been hunted like an animal, and he saw a capacity for hope that shamed him. He had convinced himself that the world was only pain and survival. She knew the pain better than he did, yet she still wanted the softness. He wanted to reach out to her, but he didn't know how. He felt clumsy, rough, unworthy. Ilkay stood up slowly. The mood in the room shifted from storytelling to something sharper, more dangerous. She looked at him with a strange mixture of fear and defiance. She reached for the top button of her dress. Silas stopped breathing. "What are you doing?" he rasped. She did not answer. She undid the button, then the next. She loosened the fabric and let it slide down her left shoulder, exposing the skin to the lantern light. Silas flinched. Her shoulder was a map of violence. There were old, silvered lines where a whip had cut the skin. There was a puckered, ugly scar near her collarbone that looked like a bullet wound that had healed badly. The skin was marked, ruined. She stood there, trembling, the dress gathered at her chest, her shoulder bare. "Do you see?" she asked, her voice shaking. "This is what men have done. This is what I am. Marks, pain." She stepped closer to him. The heat of her body radiated across the small space. "Can you see? Can you see me? Or only this? Can you ever look at me like that man looked at the woman, with tenderness?" Silas stood up. His chair scraped loudly against the floor. He looked at the scars, and a wave of fury rose in him. Not at her, but at the men who had done this. And beneath the fury, a surging tide of tenderness that terrified him. He moved around the table. She flinched, bracing herself, but he did not reach for her skin. He reached for the heavy wool coat hanging on the peg by the door. He stepped in front of her. He could see the pulse beating frantically in the hollow of her throat. He could see the tears standing in her eyes. He gently draped the coat over her shoulders, covering the scars, covering the pain. He pulled the lapels together, his knuckles grazing her chin. He kept his hands there, holding the coat closed, creating a shelter for her. "I see you." "Ilkay," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I see you." He looked deep into her eyes, willing her to believe him. "And I swear to you," he whispered, "I will never take anything from you. I will never add a mark to you. Never." She let out a sob, a broken sound that seemed to tear itself out of her chest. She slumped forward, her forehead resting against his chest, the rough wool of his coat scratching her cheek. Silas hesitated for a second, then wrapped his arms around her. Over the coat, he held her tight, feeling the tremors running through her body. He held her as the wind howled outside, trying to get in. They stood like that for a long time, the barrier of the coat between them, yet closer than they had ever been. That night, Silas did not send her back to the barn. It was not spoken, but it was understood. The barn was cold, and the distance was too great. He took the extra quilt and made a pallet on the floor near the hearth. He gave her his bed. "Sleep," he said, blowing out the lantern. "You are safe here." The room plunged into darkness. Silas lay on the hard floor, listening to the settling of the logs. He could hear the rustle of the mattress as she settled in. He was hyper-aware of her presence, of the woman lying a few feet away in the dark. He was restless. Every nerve in his body was singing. He felt a profound sense of protectiveness, but also a deep, aching loneliness that was suddenly more acute because the remedy was so close. Across the room, Ilkay lay awake as well. She pulled Silas's pillow close, smelling the scent of him, tobacco and pine soap. She touched her shoulder where the coat had rested. She had terrified herself by showing him the scars, by asking for the impossible, but he had not turned away. He had covered her, in the dark of the Arizona night, with the wind scouring the walls. Two lonely people lay awake under the same roof, separated by a few feet of wooden floorboards and a lifetime of scars, both wondering if the fragile bridge they were building would be strong enough to hold them when the storm truly broke. The flour sack was light. When Silas lifted it from the pantry shelf, the lack of weight traveled up his arm like a dull ache. He set it on the table and folded the top down. There was enough for maybe 3 days of biscuits, if they were careful. The salted pork was gone. The coffee was a memory. Nothing but dregs in the bottom of a tin. Silas looked out the window. Ilkay was by the woodpile, her back to him. She was stripping bark from a cedar branch, her hands moving with a repetitive, hypnotic rhythm. She had been with him for 2 weeks now. The town had not come for him yet, but the silence from Dry Creek was louder than any shouting. He knew they were talking. He knew Holt was stirring the pot, letting the fears simmer until it boiled over into violence. He walked out onto the porch. The air was thick with the scent of impending rain that never fell, just hung in the sky as bruise-colored clouds that taunted the parched earth. "We are running low," Silas said. Ilkay stopped her work. She turned, wiping a strand of black hair from her forehead. She looked at the house, then at the empty horizon. "I know," she said. She dropped the branch and walked toward him. She moved differently now. The skittishness of the hunted animal was gone, replaced by a wary determination. She stopped at the foot of the steps. "I must go," she said. Silas felt a sharp pang in his chest, surprising in its intensity. He crossed his arms, leaning against the rough-hewn post. "Go where? Back to the hills? You will starve before you get halfway up the Dragoon." "I did not come just for me," Ilkay said. Her voice was low, laced with a guilt she had been carrying since the moment she drank his water. "I came to steal." Silas watched her. He had known. Of course, no one survived in this territory on accident. "I know," he said. "No," she said, shaking her head. "You do not know. It is not just hunger. It is sickness. My people, the ones who are left, they are in a canyon 2 days' ride from here. The children are coughing blood. The old ones cannot walk. We have no powder for the rifles. We have no medicine." She looked down at her hands, which were cleaner now, but still scarred. "I was sent to find a ranch," she continued, "to find a place where the white men were careless. I was supposed to take food, take mules, and go back." She looked up at him, her eyes fierce and wet. "But you saw me," she said. "You gave me water. You covered me with your coat. And now I have stayed too long. I am warm while they are shivering. I am eating while they are chewing on bark." The guilt in her voice was a physical thing. It mirrored the guilt Silas lived with every day. He understood the weight of survival when others had fallen. He looked at the mule grazing in the paddock. He looked at the sacks of seed corn he had been saving for next spring. It was his future. It was the only thing that kept him from being a drifter. "If you go back alone," Silas said slowly, "you will be caught. Holt has riders patrolling the wash. They will see a lone woman with a pack and they will shoot first. I have to try, she said. Silas pushed off the post. He walked down the steps and stood in front of her. He was a practical man. He knew the odds. Helping her here, on his land, was dangerous. Helping her out there, bringing aid to a renegade band, was treason. It was a hanging offense. But he looked at her face, and he remembered the feel of her trembling against him when he held her coat shut. He remembered the silence of the cabin before she came, a silence that tasted like dust and whiskey. "We will take the wagon as far as the rock slide," he said. "Then we will pack the mule." Ilkay stared at him. You will come." Silas nodded. "I have sacks of corn. I have some quinine left from the fever year, and I have ammunition." He saw the shock register in her eyes. "You cannot," she whispered. "If the soldiers catch you helping us, they will hang me." Silas finished. "I know." "Why?" she asked. "Why do you do this?" Silas looked past her, toward the jagged line of the mountains. "Because I am tired of the killing," he said, "and because I do not want to go back to an empty house." They left an hour before sunset. It was a risk, moving while there was still light. But they needed to cover the open ground before the moon rose. They loaded the mule with everything Silas could spare: bags of cornmeal, dried beans, a small keg of molasses, blankets, and 2 boxes of Winchester cartridges. The journey was a descent into a harsh, prehistoric world. The land rose up to meet them, twisting into shapes that defied logic. They moved through dry riverbeds where the stones were white as bone, and up steep, crumbling trails where the mesquite tore at their clothes with thorny fingers. Silas led the mule, his rifle in his hand. Ilkay walked beside him, her eyes scanning the ridgelines. They did not speak much. The terrain demanded their breath. By the second night, they were high in the foothills. The heat of the day vanished the moment the sun dropped, replaced by a biting cold that seeped through their coats. The air was thin and sharp. They made camp in a shallow depression beneath a shelf of granite. It was too dangerous to light a fire. The smell of smoke would carry for miles. They ate cold beans and hardtack, sitting shoulder to shoulder against the rock wall. The sky above them was a crushed velvet canopy of stars, so thick and bright they seemed to press down on the earth. "It is cold," Silas said. Seeing her shiver, Ilkay pulled her blanket tighter. "It is the wind. It cuts." Silas hesitated. Then he opened his own heavy wool coat. "Come here." She looked at him, her face pale in the starlight. She did not argue. She shifted closer, and he wrapped the coat and his blanket around both of them. They sat huddled together, sharing the only heat they had, the heat of their own blood. It was awkward at first. Silas held his body stiff, careful not to press too hard, but as the cold deepened, biology overrode propriety. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He relaxed his arm, letting it rest around her waist to keep the blanket in place. He could feel the steady rise and fall of her breathing. He could smell the sage in her hair. It was an intimacy born of survival, but it stirred something in him that had been dormant for years. It was not just desire, though that was there, a low hum in his blood. It was a sense of rightness, of fitting. Sometime in the deepest part of the night, the wind picked up, moaning through the crevices of the rocks like a dying animal. Silas was dozing when he felt her jerk violently. Ilkay cried out, a sharp, ragged sound. She thrashed against him, her hands clawing at the blanket. No fire! The babies! She was trapped in a nightmare, lost in the smoke of a memory. Silas tightened his grip. Ilkay, wake up! She did not hear him. She was fighting an invisible enemy. Get back! She screamed, her voice cracking. Silas turned, pulling her fully into his arms. He pressed her face against his chest, muffling her cries. He rocked her, holding her tight enough to ground her. "You are here," he whispered into her hair. "You are safe. I have you. It is just the wind." She gasped, her body rigid, her heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. Slowly, the reality of the cold night and the solid warmth of his chest broke through the terror. She went limp, her hands clutching the front of his shirt. Silas kept whispering, a stream of nonsense words, soft and steady. Easy now. I am here. I am not going anywhere. She lifted her head. Her eyes were wide, dark pools of fear. She looked at his face, illuminated by the starlight. I saw them, she whispered. The blue coats. They were burning the wickiups. I know, Silas said softly. I know. She looked at his mouth, then she looked at his eyes. The fear in her gaze began to shift, replaced by a desperate need for connection, for something alive and real to chase away the ghosts. She leaned in, just an inch. Silas felt the pull. It was magnetic. He wanted to kiss her. He wanted to bury his face in her neck and forget the world. But he felt the tremor in her hands, the fragility of her in that moment. To touch her now, while she was raw from the nightmare, felt like taking advantage of her fear. He gently placed his hand on the back of her head and guided it back to his shoulder. Rest, he said, his voice rough. I will watch. She stayed there, pressed against him, and he felt the tension slowly leave her body. But the air between them remained charged, vibrating with the ghost of the kiss that hadn't happened. They reached the camp late the next afternoon. It was not a camp so much as a place where people